On a quiet Monday morning in Georgetown, Washington, D.C., Marcus Thompson sat alone at his corner table in an upscale coffee shop, focused intently on his laptop. At 40 years old, his tailored suit and composed demeanor spoke of success and professionalism, though his FBI badge remained discreetly tucked away in his jacket pocket. The morning crowd bustled around him as baristas crafted elaborate drinks, the sunlight streaming through large windows, creating a peaceful atmosphere. This tranquility shattered when Officer James Barrett's police cruiser rolled to a stop outside. The 35-year-old white officer had received a call about a suspicious man who had been in the coffee shop too long. Barrett entered the establishment, his hand resting casually on his belt as he immediately fixed his gaze on Marcus. The tension in the air became palpable as Barrett approached Marcus's table, his authoritative stance already drawing attention from other patrons. The tension crackled through the morning air as Marcus Thompson stood up from his table, his movements deliberately measured. The other coffee shop patrons had fallen silent, their morning conversations dying mid-sentence as they watched the scene unfold. Officer Barrett's hand hadn't left his belt, his fingers drumming an anxious rhythm near his holster. "Step outside now, sir," Barrett repeated, his voice carrying that edge of authority that brooked no argument. The words came out clipped, more a command than a courtesy. Behind him, a young barista watched with wide eyes, her hand frozen over the espresso machine. Marcus began packing his laptop with exaggerated slowness, narrating each movement. "I'm closing my computer now. I'm putting it in my bag." He'd been here before, not this exact situation, but ones like it. 15 years at the FBI had taught him that survival sometimes meant swallowing pride, means moving like you're underwater, means making yourself small even when every fiber of your being screams against it. "I want the record to show," Marcus stated clearly, his voice pitched to carry to the phones now recording the incident, "that I am complying with this officer's request despite having committed no crime." His law enforcement training kicked in, documenting, preserving, protecting. Not just himself now, but the integrity of what was about to unfold. Outside, the Georgetown morning had turned into an impromptu theater. Business people paused on their way to work, phones raised like a forest of electronic eyes. The sun had climbed higher, casting harsh shadows on the sidewalk where Barrett now guided Marcus against the wall. The brick was cool against Marcus's palms as he spread them flat, legs spread in the universal posture of submission. "Stop resisting," Barrett barked, though Marcus hadn't moved a muscle. The officer's hands were rough as they patted him down, more aggressive than necessary. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus. How many times had he trained officers on proper search procedures? Then came the crucial moment. Marcus knew his next words could either defuse or detonate the situation. "Officer Barrett," he said, reading the nameplate with careful precision. "I am going to reach for my identification very slowly. It's in my left breast pocket." "I said don't move." Barrett's voice had risen an octave, stress bleeding through his professional veneer. His hand was now firmly on his weapon. But Marcus had already begun his careful choreography, thumb and forefinger pinching his jacket, moving with the delicacy of a bomb disposal expert. "My fingers are now entering my pocket," he continued his narration, as much for the gathering crowd's cameras as for Barrett's benefit. "I am removing my credentials." The black leather wallet emerged like a magic trick, flipping open to reveal the golden shield that had guided Marcus's life for the past 15 years. "Federal Bureau of Investigation," he stated, his voice now shifting subtly from compliant civilian to federal agent. "Badge number 7726. I'm the Assistant Director of the Civil Rights Division." The change in the atmosphere was physical, like a sudden drop in air pressure. Barrett's hand fell away from his weapon as if the metal had turned hot. He took one step back, then another, his face cycling through a series of expressions, shock, disbelief, and finally the dawning horror of recognition. Marcus turned around slowly, his badge still displayed. The morning sun caught the gold shield, sending a brief flash across Barrett's face. "Officer Barrett," he said, his voice level but carrying an unmistakable weight, "I'm going to need your badge number. And then you and I are going to have a very long conversation about probable cause, reasonable suspicion, and the proper application of police authority." The crowd had grown larger, their phones still recording, but Marcus wasn't playing to them anymore. His eyes were locked on Barrett, watching the younger officer's swagger deflate into something approaching understanding. This moment, Marcus realized, could go one of two ways. It could become another viral video of police misconduct, another headline about racial profiling, another reason for communities to drift further apart. Or it could become something else entirely, a teaching moment, a catalyst for change. "Sir, Barrett started, then stopped, his hand now fidgeting with his badge rather than his weapon. The transformation was already beginning, authority giving way to uncertainty. Then to the first glimmers of awareness. Marcus's next words would be crucial. They would set the tone for everything that followed. The training programs, the reforms, the long road toward understanding that lay ahead. But for now, he let the silence stretch, let the weight of the moment sink in, as the Georgetown morning hung suspended between what was and what could be. The afternoon sun slanted through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the FBI headquarters, casting long shadows across Director Chen's mahogany desk. Marcus Thompson sat in one of the leather chairs, his suit jacket slightly creased from the morning's confrontation. The incident report lay between them like a loaded weapon. Director Chen, a veteran of 3 decades in the bureau, leaned back in his chair, studying Marcus with eyes that had seen countless similar situations end in headlines and hashtags. "The precinct has a file this thick," he gestured with his thumb and forefinger spread wide, "on racial profiling complaints. Barrett's name appears 6 times in the last 2 years alone." Marcus nodded, running his finger along the edge of his coffee cup. Standard FBI issue, nothing like the artisanal brew that had started his morning. "I've read the file," he said quietly, "but I've been thinking about something different." The office fell silent except for the gentle hum of the air conditioning. Outside, Washington, D.C. continued its eternal dance of power and politics. But in here, a different kind of decision was taking shape. "The media's already calling," Director Chen continued, tapping his phone. "CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, they all want the story. FBI Civil Rights Director racially profiled, the headlines write themselves." He paused, studying Marcus's face. "It could be the push we need. Public pressure could force the department to implement those reforms we've been pushing for." Marcus stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the street where people hurried past, unaware of the decision being weighed above them. He could see a police car parked across the street, its presence now carrying new weight after the morning's events. "With respect, sir," Marcus turned back to face his superior. "I've been the face of headlines before. I've seen how these stories play out. We get 2 weeks of outrage, maybe a resignation or two, and then everything goes back to normal." He returned to his seat, leaning forward with intensity. "But what if we tried something different?" Director Chen raised an eyebrow, inviting him to continue. "Instead of making Barrett the villain in another viral video, what if we made him part of the solution?" Marcus pulled out his tablet, quickly pulling up statistics he'd gathered over the years. "Look at these numbers. Departments that implement comprehensive bias training and community engagement programs show a 40% reduction in use of force incidents. But the key isn't just the training. It's having officers who've lived through these moments leading the change. You want to work with the officer who just profiled you." Director Chen's skepticism was evident in his voice. Marcus smiled slightly. "I want to work with an officer who's at a crossroads. Think about it. Barrett's young enough to change, experienced enough to have credibility with his peers, and just got the wake-up call of his career. He's the perfect candidate for what I've been wanting to implement." He pulled up another document on his tablet, a training program proposal he'd been developing for months. A comprehensive reform initiative led by officers who've confronted their own biases and chosen to change. Not just sensitivity training, but real, ongoing mentorship and community engagement. Director Chen took the tablet, scrolling through the proposal with growing interest. "You'd be willing to put your name behind this? Work directly with Barrett?" "Sometimes the best way to break down walls is to build bridges instead," Marcus said. "Barrett doesn't lose his job. He becomes our first success story. We use this incident not to punish, but to transform." The director stood up and walked to his credenza, where photographs chronicled his own journey from rookie agent to FBI director. "You know," he said, looking at an old picture of himself as a young agent, "when I started in the bureau, change seemed impossible. The old guard was too entrenched, the systems too rigid." He turned back to Marcus. "But sometimes the impossible just needs someone willing to try a different approach." Marcus leaned forward. "Give me 3 months. Let me implement this program with Barrett's precinct as our pilot. If it doesn't show results, we can still go public with the incident. And if it does work, then instead of another viral video about what's wrong with policing, we create a model for what could be right." Director Chen returned to his desk, picking up the incident report. For a long moment, he studied it, then looked up at Marcus with a hint of a smile. 3 months, he said finally, "but I want weekly progress reports, and at the first sign, this is going sideways." "It won't," Marcus interrupted, then caught himself. "Sorry, sir, but I believe in this. More importantly, I believe people can change when we give them the right opportunity." As Marcus stood to leave, Director Chen called after him, "Thompson? This isn't just about Barrett, is it?" Marcus paused at the door. "No, sir, it's about all of us. About what kind of change is possible when we choose to see the person behind the badge. Any badge." The late afternoon sun had turned golden as Marcus left the office, his decision now set in motion. In his pocket, his phone buzzed with more media requests, but he ignored them. He had a different story to tell, one that wouldn't fit in a headline or a tweet. It would take longer, be harder to measure, but might, just might, lead to real change. The police academy classroom buzzed with tension 3 months after the coffee shop incident. Morning light filtered through Venetian blinds, casting striped shadows across the faces of 30 officers, with Officer James Barrett seated prominently in the front row. Marcus Thompson stood before them, his suit as impeccable as always, but his demeanor deliberately casual. "Let's start with a number," Marcus began, clicking to his first slide. 8 seconds. That's how long it took from entering the coffee shop to deciding I was a threat. He looked directly at Barrett, who shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Officer Barrett, would you say that's accurate?" Barrett cleared his throat. "Yes, sir. Maybe even less." His admission hung in the air, heavy with implications. "Thank you for your honesty," Marcus said, genuine appreciation in his voice. "Now, let's break down those 8 seconds." He clicked to the next slide, showing a brain scan. In that time, your amygdala, the fear center of your brain, had already activated. Your cortisol levels spiked. And most importantly, years of unconscious programming had already started running their script. The room remained silent as Marcus moved through his presentation, but it wasn't the hostile silence of the first session 3 weeks ago. This was the silence of recognition, of uncomfortable truths being confronted. "But here's what's fascinating," Marcus continued, moving to stand directly in front of Barrett's desk. "Those same 8 seconds. They're also enough time to interrupt that programming. Officer Barrett, would you share what you've learned about that?" Barrett stood, facing his fellow officers. His posture had changed over the weeks, less defensive, more open. "It's about creating new mental checkpoints," he said, his voice gaining confidence. "When I feel that initial reaction now, I've trained myself to stop and ask, what evidence do I actually have? What assumptions am I making? What would I do if this person looked different?" A veteran officer in the back raised his hand. "That's all well and good in training, but on the street, we don't have time for all that analysis. Sometimes we have to trust our instincts." Marcus nodded, having anticipated this common objection. "Let's look at some numbers." He switched to a new slide showing statistics. Officers who've implemented these checkpoints report no increase in response time to actual threats, but they show a 60% reduction in unnecessary confrontations. "Officer Barrett, your own statistics over the past 2 months." Barrett straightened. "My civilian complaint rate is down 70%. Successful arrests are up 15%, and my community feedback scores have never been higher." The veteran officer leaned forward, interest replacing skepticism. Marcus moved through the room, engaging with each officer. "This isn't about ignoring your instincts," he explained. "It's about refining them, making them more accurate, more reliable." The training session shifted to practical exercises. Officers paired up. running through scenarios designed to challenge their assumptions. Barrett, now acting as an assistant instructor, helped guide his colleagues through the exercises he'd struggled with himself weeks earlier. During a break, Barrett approached Marcus by the water cooler. "You know what's weird?" he said quietly. "I'm actually enjoying my job more now. It's like I was carrying this weight I didn't even know about." Marcus smiled. "That weight? It's what happens when we're fighting against our better selves. When we're trying to justify decisions we know, deep down, aren't right." The afternoon session focused on community engagement. Marcus brought in local residents, business owners, students, community leaders to share their experiences with law enforcement. Barrett listened intently, occasionally sharing his own journey of transformation. "The hardest part," Barrett told the class during the closing discussion, "was admitting that my suspicious person radar wasn't as accurate as I thought. But once I accepted that, everything changed. I started seeing people instead of potential threats." As the session ended, Marcus watched the officers filing out, noting the subtle changes in their body language, their interactions with each other. Some lingered to ask questions, share experiences, or just think aloud about what they'd learned. Barrett stayed behind, helping to pack up the presentation materials. "You know," he said, straightening chairs, "when this started, I thought it was going to be just another sensitivity training. Check the box, get it done." Marcus paused in collecting his papers. "And now I realize it's not about being sensitive. It's about being smart. Being better at our jobs." Barrett hesitated. "I've been thinking about getting certified to teach some of these sessions myself." Marcus nodded, hiding his satisfaction. This was how real change happened, not through force or shame, but through understanding that spread from officer to officer, precinct to precinct. As they left the classroom, they passed a wall of police department photos, graduating classes through the years. Marcus paused, studying the faces, the gradual changes in diversity, the slow evolution of the institution. "You know what the real transformation is," he said to Barrett. "It's not just about changing how we police. It's about changing why we police. When we start seeing our role as guardians rather than warriors, everything shifts." Barrett looked at the photos too, then at his reflection in the glass. "I see it now," he said quietly, "and I can't unsee it." As they walked out into the evening, Marcus noticed a young officer from the class practicing the mental checkpoints they'd learned, carefully observing his own reactions to passers-by. Small changes, rippling outward. This was how transformation happened, not in dramatic moments, but in countless small decisions to be better, to see clearer, to serve truer. 1 year after their first encounter, Marcus and Barrett sat across from each other in the same coffee shop, but under vastly different circumstances. Both in civilian clothes, they discussed the changes in Barrett's approach to policing. His arrest numbers had decreased, but his community trust metrics had risen significantly. Through the window, they could see the physical manifestation of their work. Officers chatting casually with local business owners, walking alongside citizens instead of viewing them with suspicion. Barrett offered a genuine apology, not just for that day, but for his previous mindset. Marcus's response encapsulated the heart of their journey. We all have blind spots. The question is what we do once they're exposed. Their conversation reflected a deeper truth about institutional change, that it happens one interaction, one conversation, one coffee shop at a time. The transformation extended far beyond just Barrett and Marcus. The training program became a model for other precincts, demonstrating how confronting bias could lead to more effective community policing. Their story became not another headline about racial profiling, but rather a case study in how personal growth could drive institutional change. The coffee shop, where it all began, transformed from a site of confrontation to a symbol of reconciliation. Regular customers who had witnessed the original incident now saw the same space hosting community meetings between officers and residents. Marcus and Barrett's regular coffee meetings became a visible reminder that change, while challenging, was possible through understanding, education, and the willingness to grow. The ripple effects of that morning continued to spread throughout the department and the community, proving that sometimes the most powerful changes start with a single moment of recognition and the courage to choose a different path forward.